Before turning it over to Dr. Paret, let me just make an administrative note. We do have lunch catered in the back here. So Dr. Paret finishes his comments. We will grab a drink at lunch and then come back. And I will use the power of the kind of the convener to say, we have a panel discussion and questions. I think we should just have a free-ranging discussion, whether it's among panel members or people have questions. And then we can just go from there once we get to our lunch. Dr. Paret, your reputation precedes you. In many ways, we're so lucky whenever we have continental writers who become influential in the English-speaking world, is because they've been mediated through a great translator. And that translator becomes almost a co-author of the work. This past week I was reading something that probably most of us would agree with, which called Clausewitz's On War, the Bible of the U.S. military. Well, if it is the Bible, you're the Jerome or the Tyndall, because you translate it into the vulgar language of all of us. And to that extent, along with distinguished Prussians, and you're a co-author of the book for us. And the decisions you made about how certain words or concepts would be translated might resonate far beyond the book itself and kind of how we think about war. So I turn it over to you, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks very much. I have to say that I'm not the translator. Michael Howard and I are the translators, and Michael, who is still with us, would like to be here today, but I think at least we want to mention him. It was initially his idea to do this, and then he persuaded me to help him, and many years ago, many decades ago, and I think we both have regretted it ever since. Well, I was very interested in, of course, in hearing the comments and thoughts of the other members of the panel, and it might be appropriate if, in my remarks, I'll just discuss one of the subjects of that I try to develop in my talk, and that has to do with Clausewitz's ideas. And Clausewitz's ideas, it may help us place them into our own time if we reconstruct why and how he arrived at them. So, if you don't mind, I will just present a brief review of the stages of his intellectual and emotional encounter with war. And that begins with his first experience of war as a 12-year-old in the campaign of 1792 against revolutionary France. His regimental commander was known even in Prussia for his rigid adherence to regulations. That's an example of the formalism that then characterized military thought in Central Europe. And that even decades later, this man is mentioned twice in On War to illustrate the damage such rigidity can cause, suggests the critical impact these ideas had on the young ensign. When Prussia withdrew from the war with France in 1795, Clausewitz began to sort out and reflect on his experiences. And in the following decades, he took three major steps toward his future conception of war. And as already has been suggested, influenced by lectures on the thought of the dominant German philosopher of the age, Immanuel Kant, he clarified his ideas on what a theory is. Secondly, He rejected dogmatism in all its forms. And again, in agreement with Kant, Kant demanded that people rise above passivity and think, but he didn't teach them what to think. And this partiality towards independent reflection and judgment is further borne out by Clausewitz's first publication, when he was 25, a strongly negative review of a book in which the then prominent Prussian theorist Heinrich von Bülow developed a mechanical, strategic, and operational system. Clausewitz, really in a rather emotional, for him unusually frank, impolite way, convicted the whole concept that Bülow presented. And the third preparatory step towards his theories was something that was sometimes difficult for later generations to understand. And that was that Clausewitz developed a belief that to understand war, he must expand his knowledge of contemporary conflict with an objective study of war in the past. Even in an activity as determined by technical matters as war, the character and constantly changing details of war today, he thought, can best be understood if we also take account of what had gone before. For one thing, it enables us to establish the permanent elements of war. You have to combine present and past to come close to permanency in one's conception of war. And here, incidentally, we see the basis for Clausewitz's lasting interest in history, which, as you know, makes up the larger part of his written work. To mention an early example of the theoretical consequences of his historical interest, in his 20s, Clausewitz read several works by Machiavelli. Machiavelli, who he notes, clarified for him the permanent relationship between politics and war. To his astonishment, he saw that a 16th century text had relevance to issues centuries later. A further link between history and Clausewitz's theoretical work is the emphasis on psychological or moral factors, and that also has already been mentioned and is an extremely important element in both in his history and in his theoretical work. Very evident in his interpretations of Frederick the Great and of Napoleon, interpretations that we encounter throughout his writings. On war itself, combines the recognition of such permanent elements as the absolute or limited nature of war, one or the other. You can decide, are you going to fight a more or less absolute or a definitely limited war? The psychological strength and weakness of friends and opponents, the nature and effect of friction, the importance of numbers, the character of various strategies, and so on, combine these with ways of dealing with them. You identify these elements, which in changing form are always there, and you develop ways of dealing with them. The work neither describes a particular campaign in detail, nor forces the various possibilities of action into a unitary strategic or operational system, which was the fashion of the time. Throughout his work, Clausewitz emphasizes the variety of conditions and possibilities and the importance of granting what he once called reasonable scope to informed judgment. Reasonable scope to informed judgment. On War combines a description of war as he sees it with a discussion of the effective use of the means of war. Two very different themes, which nevertheless support each other. A theoretical understanding of war contributes to the effective use of its means. Knowing what can be done and how to do it adds to our understanding of what war is. The coexistence of these two themes in the book has two effects. Their interaction make on war the unusual and unusually creative work that it is. It also poses difficulties for readers interested in one subject but not the other. Readers who ask either what war is or how to win it. War has, of course, changed enormously since Clausewitz lived. To mention just one difference, the wars he mainly writes about are waged by structured political entities. Even when he discusses popular forces, and he does that frequently, they bond with established authority. He writes a great deal, for example, on the Spanish conflict during the Napoleonic era, talks about popular movements, but they are popular movements allied to a legal authority. In Spain, people act against the king imposed on them by Napoleon. He constantly writes about popular movements, but popular movements in the service of a legal, traditional idea. He does not discuss operations by and against insurgents with expansionist ideologies that make them a state within the state. And that is an important difference, one of several between Clausewitz's view of war and war today. And I think that rather than minimize these differences in our search for the current relevance of On War, we should identify and confront them. In some cases, that will diminish or eliminate today's pragmatic usefulness of Clausewitz's work. In others, the passage of time need not affect its value if we analyze how past and present differ and yet are alike. Repeatedly, in constructing his theory, Clausewitz compared the new with the old. I mentioned earlier how valuable and contemporary he found what Machiavelli had written hundreds of years earlier. And his occupation with this ancient text is representative of his comparative and comprehensive way of thinking about war. And this characteristic episode in his intellectual development, his reading when he was 25, 26, his reading of Machiavelli and writing that now he finally understands the interaction of politics and war. This reading of Machiavelli's text, so important in the growth of his ideas, also offers us advice. And I would put it simply this way: as Clausewitz read Machiavelli, we should read Clausewitz. The links between past and present that he found in Machiavelli's writings, we can find in On War. Clausewitz's ideas on war, politics, and the development of policy are more up to date than one might wish. And they continue to deserve close study. That is the area of war, politics, and policy. His chapters on strategy and operation, strategic and operational issues, are more remote. But they too may remain instructive if we, with our current concerns, note their differences to our time and yet how they may relate to aspects of the issues that we face. A careful reading of his accounts of challenges and decisions in, let's say, 1806 or 1812, and their divergence from those of 2015, but also their similarities, may give us a better or even a new understanding of the problems that we face. Our practical response to an analysis stemming from his time is clearly not to search it for models or actions that today originate in different contexts and are executed with very different means. But what we can do is to recognize that as Clausewitz gained a broader, more generalized view of war by combining his experiences with his understanding of the past, so may we. And when we read On War, that gives us one way of doing it. That is to compare what he tells us about his time and about war as such with our experiences and our understanding of the time in which we live. And that will deepen, should deepen our thinking about similar problems, and based on that, add depth and strength to our policies. We don't attempt to copy him or even to reshape a basic argument so that it fits into our time, but we try to expand our perspective as he tried to expand his and go on from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paret.